said, I'm sort of, or insinuated, I'm sort of a jack of all trades, and I have a terrible tendency to get interested in stuff and then to follow it through. And I've been like that, I think, all my life, but particularly in the past while. So when I'm going to see if I can share this with you. I've taken my laptop beside me, so let's see what happens when I share this, and what you're actually going to see if I hit. Let's see. If I hit this, and it will hopefully, can you see anything at this stage? That's my question.
No.
It's coming.
Yeah, it's coming up now.
So can you see it full screen, or can you see the presenters?
If people choose,
Presenters, yeah.
If people choose speaker view, then they'll get rid of some of us and they'll see you. And we can see 2 slides.
Okay, so you can see, I'm going to then, so bear with me a second and I'll see if I can swap these around. Which I may not be able to do. And if I can't, then that's okay. Swap presenter. Now can you see that now? Can you see the whole slide?
Yes.
Yeah, that's better.
Perfect, excellent. That's what I wanted. And it's much better for me as well, because I look straight ahead and you guys get you get the full slide, and I get the 2 slides. So as Betty said, what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is this idea of what, of particularly young women in 19th century Dublin, and I'm going to mention a little bit about Cork as well, who might have had an interest in geology and how they might have gone about actually studying the topic. This has come about through an interest that I had in the history of geology in general. And let's see if I will actually change the, there you go. So this came about the history. I'm interested in the history of geology. This goes back to when I was working on the Geological Survey. One of the first things that I did when I was mapping the Quaternary sediments for Kilkenny was to have a look at the old 6-inch field maps, which are an absolute treasure that the Geological Survey has. And I got interested in the people that were mapping at that time in the mid-19th century, just to see the detail that these gentlemen, as it was, were putting into these maps. And so a couple of years ago, I started to look particularly at George Victor de Noyer's work, and to do a little bit more delving into that figure in 19th century. But while I was doing that, I discovered in the Geological Survey archives the letter books that of both the incoming letters and the outgoing letters. So these are copies of letters that would have been sent from the Geological Survey to other agencies. And one thing that caught my attention at the time were these types of letters. These are the letters of Jukes. So Joseph B. Jukes, who was the director of the Geological Survey from 1851 or so to 1869 when he passed away. And at that time, he was writing to Sir Robert Kane, as you can see at the top, and he was sending Robert Kane the list of students who were going to get medals for studying geology in his classes. And what struck me about these letters was that there were both male and female names in there. So you can see in this letter here, you might just be able to make it out. And I'll be pulling out these names later on, so don't worry too much. But you might just be able to make out the second name there is Miss J.A. Leeper. And he gives the number of points that she scores. So she scores 795 points. These are all marks out of 1,000. So she gets 79% in that exam. And you can see she's second highest mark on that list of names. There are 3 other females there. So the 6th name down is Miss M.E. Quinlan, followed by Miss K.K. McKay, and then followed by Miss A.M. Smith. I was quite surprised, pleasantly surprised to see females studying geology and scoring marks akin to obviously males, but also scoring the highest marks at times. And so I said, this is kind of an interesting study. I'll have a look at this because, as I said, that's what I tend to do, is get slightly distracted from citizen science and nice water monitoring stuff and go down these kind of interesting rabbit holes as well. So I started looking at this. And the difficulties of studying women in the mid-19th century and indeed the early 20th century are well acknowledged. Betty herself has done quite a bit of work in terms of trying to piece together these, as she's mentioned, these hidden histories. Because oftentimes as women obviously change their names, once they get married, they get lost. Also at times they can no longer continue on their studies, or they can no longer continue on their degrees. So I said, let's see how far I can take this. Let's see if I can trace some of these back. So what I'm going to do this evening is just to present an overview of the educational context, what was happening, what these lecture series were, have a look a little bit at the curriculum before looking at some of the women who actually studied, and I'll give you some examples of why they were studying and postulate some ideas as to what they were studying. So first of all, in terms of the background to these, the lecture series that Jukes is referring to here is the lecture series of the Museum of Irish Industry. The Museum of Irish Industry, the MII, was set up with the Geological Survey almost as sister organizations in 1845. Robert Kane was put at the helm of the Museum of Irish Industry, which initially was called the Museum of Economic Geology, the sister museum being the Museum of Economic Geology in London, in Germain Street. And Henry James was the initial head of the Geological Survey in Ireland. The two institutions were separate theoretically, but they had the common goal of affording geological knowledge in Ireland and the wider mission of the development of geology as a science, as a new discipline within the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The original goal of the museum itself was to show the application of geology to the useful purposes of life, which is a very grandiose ideal, according to the model set up in London, in Germain Street. The various specimens that were collected by the surveyors of the Geological Survey were to be placed within the museum so that they could be, as was said at the time, to be put before the public in such an intelligible and popular form as shall be best accord with the objectives of such an institution. It is in fact this proportion of the museum's labour that the public attention will be necessarily directed. So the Geological Survey were collecting samples, but they were giving them to the museum so the museum could use them as a teaching tool, as an educational tool for the public, for the general public. The museum's role as a bridge between the Geological Survey and the general public became even more concrete with the creation of public lecture series and courses. These provided interested members of the public with the knowledge of geology, and they will be ultimately enable them, the public, to appreciate and utilise the results of the survey. So for Beat's idea of, Beat Duke's idea for the lecture series was for them to be able to put into use what the survey was doing. Both the buildings of the museum in Dublin and in London were designed with lecture theatres in place so that they would actually have spaces for public lectures. The lecture theatre in Dublin held 500 people for the provision of classes. The lecture series also had two other objectives that were stated both by Jukes himself and by Robert Kane. Jukes said that one of the reasons for the lectures, for the public to be invited into these lectures was so that the people who were surveying, so the likes of dukes and others who would be giving the lectures, would actually be able to elicit information from these people. While Kane himself, who was the head of the museum, saw the lecture series as a means, as he says, to withdraw the Irish mind from political and polemical disputes through acquiring accurate scientific information. So he wanted the public to be not worried about what had gone on in the famine or other disputes that might have been around the place at the time. You can see here the Museum of Irish Industry as it was in Stephen's Green, which is now a government building. And it still is a government building, I should say. So the creation of the lecture series was part of a wider environment of the making available education for the Irish public. You must remember back in the 19th century, the system of national schools, which provided free primary education for all, was established in 1831. So this is a little bit, just a little bit more than 20 years previously. And this began to roll out across the island of Ireland in the following years. It was at a time as well when the printed press was beginning to rise. And this again was along with the primary schools, which taught people to read. The fact that they had access to printed press now meant that they could be educated up to a higher level. So literacy began to increase. While primary education was accessible, it was much more difficult for females to access education beyond primary level until the intermediate schools for girls opened in the 1860s and 70s. So there's a time, particularly in the 1850s, when education for women particularly stops at around 12 years of age. Kane had a very strong idea and belief in popular education. And he had been instrumental in organising public lecture series on scientific topics in the Royal Dublin Society in the 1830s. When he was appointed to the Museum of Irish Industry, he wanted to continue that idea of public lectures within the museum itself. In 1854, the Department of Art and Science in London, which had been set up the previous year, told the RDS that the grant which had paid the salaries for the lectures was to be transferred to the museum as the main institution for industrial education. This, of course, was music to Kane's ears, because now all of a sudden he had money which he could spend on providing a lecture series for scientific purposes within the museum. After some negotiation with London, a compromise was agreed so that the two bodies between the RDS and the MII would share resources, each running a lecture series through a committee that was centrally based. In Kane's address before those attending the prize giving in 1859, he remarked that, "Before all, the object for which this institution is founded is educational, and not merely the education directly of the number necessarily limited who receive instruction within its walls, but also that each individual here instructed may become in his own turn a centre of educational light and progress, so that the confines beyond which are the dark and dismal realms of ignorance, prejudice and error may yearly be further removed." So he saw it as an educational institution, not only for those attending, but also that those attending would then educate others. The geology lecture series began immediately. So in 1854, the lecture series of geology began. Jukes was the first to give a lecture in geology. He was the local director of the Geological Survey. He delivered the first introductory lecture in geology to a full audience. Remember that the lecture theatre held 500 people, so a full audience was 500 or more. At the dawn of the new science, it was recognised that even if large numbers of students attended the lecture series, and the lecture series could hold as many as could fit into the room, there would not be a demand for the services of so many geologists. So not all of these people were going to go on to become geologists, and many of them were just there for the interest or for other industries for which geology was an important part. the number of participants in these lectures was considerable, with the lecture theatre initially frequently being reported as full. From the year after they're founded, from 1855, participants had to pay a small fee for attending the lectures, and the numbers of the attendees were recorded. In Dublin, the lectures ran both in the afternoons and in the evenings to cater for different audiences who wished to participate. So those who could not attend in the afternoon session because they may have been working could attend in the evening. From 1856, the museum organises examinations after the lecture series. Not everybody attends the examinations, but those who want to have a certificate can actually log in or can sign up to these examinations. And this becomes very useful to us because while the names of those who attended the public lectures are not recorded, the names attending the examinations are recorded. And it's those lists that I've shown you in that initial letter from Jukes. You can see here one of the general notifications that this lecture series is going to take place. This is in the Dublin Daily Express from 1857, talking about the lecture series itself that Professor Jukes is going to record or is going to give. This particular module is on geology and its applications to the arts, the Theatre Museum of Irish Industry on Monday. You can see this is one of the afternoon lectures. This is the one at 4 o'clock. And the first one is free, as all good promotional work. The first one is free, and after that you've got to pay a fee of 3 shillings and 6pence to enter. There's a move to standardise the lectures and the examinations between London and Dublin in 1860. This is highly debated and in the end rejected by the museum, by Dublin. From the very beginning, women were allowed into the lecture series. So there was never any question as to whether they could or could not enter. King was totally in support of women's education and equal education for all at this time. From 1856, the students at the lectures could present themselves at examinations, and the highest scoring candidates were forwarded to London for consideration for the prize from the Department of Art and Science. It was always a minority of students who registered for the examinations, but as their names are recorded, we can get some type of insight into the audience that were at these examinations or at these lectures, these public lectures. The audience in general was made up of a cross-section of Dublin's population. Jukes had great reason to be satisfied with the general attention and assiduity displayed by the classes, and with the amount of proficiency displayed by those who passed the examinations, he wrote in 1857. Others mentioned the fact that the audience at the lectures was pretty largely attended by females, by boys from the middle schools and the middle classes, and scarcely at all by those who were able to procure instruction in these subjects in other places where it is to be obtained, I mean the universities. So these were places where those who could not attend the universities were going. And this is, again, pulled out by this research. We can see here in this graph the number of students who got prizes. You can see that the numbers are quite small. So 8 students in 1860 presented themselves for prizes, or presented themselves at the examination and received prizes, 10 in 1861, and the highest being 14. What's interesting here is the proportion of men and women. So in 1860, there are equal proportions of men and women. So 4 women and 4 men present themselves with prizes. We can assume from this that this is quite similar to the proportion in the general public, in the general lectures, so that it may not be 50-50, it is quite evenly spread in 1860. It may go down a little bit other years, but there's always a presence of females within the audience and within the prizes. The class of persons who attended the lectures was different in the day and the evenings, as I said before. The daytime classes were not as well attended as the evening lectures. Kane reports that the attendance at day courses consists, as you might expect, entirely of the upper and middle classes, members of the Royal Dublin Society, young ladies qualifying themselves to be governesses, schoolboys, etc. And the evening courses consist of the middle classes and clerks who are occupied with their own business during the day, with a proportion of the artisan classes. So one of the things that is going to crop up is this idea of ladies qualifying themselves to be governesses, because one of the questions that I had is, why are they doing this? They obviously see a future in studying geology, and one of the reasons for doing this is to become a governess. The lectures weren't just in Dublin though. So this is a map of the regional lectures. From 1857, the lecture committee accepted a request from other learned societies that had been set up in towns and cities throughout Ireland, many of which were from the Society for Useful Information, or Useful Knowledge, sorry, and other like-minded societies. The regional lectures were set up to satisfy a want that is much more felt in this country, in the countryside, than in this city. That of teachers competent to instruct in the various branches of natural and physical sciences, according to the committee, the MII committee, Museum Committee. The regional lectures follow the same format as the lectures in Dublin, so they were open to the public. In the same way, they also had the examination at the end. The regional lectures in geology were given by the local geology professors. So for Cork, Professor Robert Harkins of UCC, although Kinahan and of the Geological Survey and Dukes also went around the country to give lectures. Professor King in Galway, in Queen's College Galway, gave lectures in Galway. Each lecture series, as I mentioned, concluded with an examination to which the students could accede. Students who scored the top prizes in the regional examinations, like those in Dublin, received a prize, which generally is a selection of books, with some people receiving lectures. The lecture in Cork, for example, there in 1859, the lecture series in Cork, that was given by Harkness in October. There were 250 people attending that, 18 people attended the examination, 6 of whom received prizes, 2 of whom were female. So Fanny Townsend achieved the 3rd prize and Minnie Allen achieved the 5th prize. So again, women are attending those. In Carlow in 1857, which was one of the first lecture series, Dukes gave the geology series there. In that, there were 3 women who presented themselves for prizes, or who presented themselves at the examination and who won prizes, 2 of whom who won prizes. One, Jeannie Franklin, scored the highest mark and received the medal that year. So again, she's top of the class and she's outdoing everybody else. What on earth do they study? Well, initially this depends on like all modules, it depends on the lecture. So initially there wasn't a curriculum. We can get one of the interesting things about this is that the curriculum was never actually written down, but we can gain some idea of what they're studying through Dukes's geology manual, a student's manual of geology, which, as you can see, is from this particular copy of it, which is housed now in UCD, is from the Museum of Irish Industry, and has obviously been attacked by somebody's coffee over the generations. Dukes was of the opinion that the most important question to be asked of the lecture series was that the instruction given is sound and real, and it is adapted to answer a worthy and legitimate end. Duke says that past experience has shown me that it is impossible to go completely over the subject of geology, so long as the lectures were divided into separate and independent courses. I have adopted this session, he says in this book, I've adopted this session the plan of making all the lectures parts of one continuous course, divided as much as possible into 3 groups, but all equally necessary for those who may intend to come into the final special examination on geology in the general examination at the close of the session. Anywhere that Dukes lectured, he also went and concluded the lectures with a lecture on the geology of the area in which he was lecturing. So he always concluded with geology of Carlow, geology of Cork, and geology wherever that may be. And he also took students on a field trip, which is obviously very important for what we're doing. He tended to break things up into these 3 general topics. So geognosy, I don't know how to pronounce that, but what he saw as petrology and lithology, paleontology, and then the history of the formation of the crust of the globe. He has left us some examples of questions. So just these are the types of questions that were asked in the examinations. So there's one which is related to Cork there: give a generalized section of the River Lee to the sea, point out the position and age of the rocks in the neighborhood of Bandon. These are some of these types of questions that you could ask today in an examination at first year, second years in university. Some really detailed stuff in there. So what about these women that I've sort of been mentioning at the occasionally? So the women who studied geology from the outset were welcomed at the Museum of Irish Industry and to the examinations. Just as 2 years later at the foundation of the Geological Association, female members were also welcomed. Indeed, Kane reported to the Commission of Inquiry in 1862 when he was asked what subjects were most suited to the female genius. Kane says, their greater sensitivity and sensitiveness and power of appreciating differences secure to them a proficiency in zoology and botany, but their success is not confined to these sciences. In natural philosophy, chemistry, and geology, some of the highest prizes have been taken by ladies. All of the records for students are not available, so the most accurate way we have of identifying how many women were attending the lectures is by looking at the list of students who took part in the examinations. This figure shows some of these. You can see from the very outset, so Miss Frances Elizabeth Armstrong was the first lady to achieve a prize in geology. That same year, she also achieved a prize in natural history. At this particular point, Kane, at the prize giving ceremony, which was a huge event attended by lots of dignitaries around Dublin, Kane says at that event in his speech, hitherto it has been the practice not to include the female portion of the community in their educational arrangements. And generally speaking, the whole scheme of educational system has been to supply scientific education to gentlemen only. But in the formation of the classes of the present institution, they recognized no distinction of sex. Consequently, several ladies had been students and in the competition for prizes distinguished themselves in a very high degree. It was a fact worthy of attention that precisely those qualities of the female mind, which it might be expected would be most characteristically developed, manifested their influence in the examination. The lady students, though they filled high positions and merited the reward which they would receive, did not occupy the first place, but in the natural science, which required accuracy and observation, clearness of perception, great power of comparison and delicacy of touch, he should perhaps feel somewhat humiliated in saying that the gentlemen were very deficient. The commencement which has been made that session in developing female talent in the pursuit of industry could not but be productive in the most beneficial results. So Kane himself is seeing that, contrary to what others may think, that women, of course, are totally suited to this and in fact have qualities which actually may make them better than men in some of these instances. from the outset, Kane's vision of education for all was realised. This First Lady here, Frances Elizabeth Armstrong, is daughter of a builder. She's got an address at 55 Bagot Street to the south of Dublin city centre, and she receives the first certificate in geology that year. When she went up to get her prize, she was loudly applauded at the prize giving ceremony. Some students attend more than once. So you can see that the second student there, Miss K.H. Egan, gets a prize in geology 2 years in a row. So she did one module and then did the second module the following year in 58. In 1857, she scores 560 points. And the following year, she receives a certificate. So she betters her score. And that same year receives a certificate in zoology. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Earl of Carlisle, who was generally the person who presented the prizes, commented in 1861 that it's always a pleasing feature in the proceedings here in the museum that whereas in almost every other quarter where we hear of classes and lectures and competitive examinations, the actors in those operations are exclusively the rougher sex, in this institution, without any departure from the rigid rule of impartiality, the lists are entered and the palm, as we have seen frequently, is carried off by the gentler aspirants, to which there is applause. And indeed, it seems only right and becoming in a country where an illustrious lady fills the very highest place in the realm, that all classes of our women should have the opportunity of showing that they can excel in the accomplishments and attainments which are consistent with the grace and modesty of the female character. It's worthy to note that Kane and Jukes believed in equal opportunity when they were afforded, that were afforded by the lecture series and examinations. In 1862, so this list here is a list of students who are taking both geology and another subject in the Museum of Irish Industry. So you can see most of these females are doing geology with zoology or with botany, which is a main one. And some of them are also doing the RDS drawing courses. Something to come back to in a minute. These women are only studying geology within the Museum of Irish Industry, so they have a pure interest in geology and nothing else. Although Ms. Underwood does take some drawing as well in the RDS. She's the only one that I found that does something else. The ones that are in red are ones that I'll speak about in a minute. In 1862, this lady, S.Q., took second prize in the examination. She was beaten by a gentleman, W.E. Dudley. Dudley scored 688 marks and Keogh scored 665 marks. That particular year is quite interesting because Jukes asks Kane to send both of their examinations to London. So he's not choosing the highest one, but he's actually saying Keogh has something to her that we need to actually send to London. And he asks London to have a look at, almost as an external examiner, to choose the one that London chooses of sufficient quality for the awarding a medal. So she has the possibility of getting the medal there. I'm sure she actually did, because I haven't found those records. Something I'd be interested to follow up, actually. The achievement of female students continued to be a source of pride for the museum throughout the 1860s. In the 1866 prize giving, Kane, in his introductory speech, mentioned that the lectures were attended by a number of ladies, many of whom were qualifying themselves most usefully and effectively for the position of governesses and teachers of superior classes. Others who attended the lectures and were animated by love of science, and some of the highest honours were taken by ladies, whose proficiency was chiefly in the natural sciences. Such a statement was met by applause. What's interesting is that in response, the Lord Lieutenant comments again on the satisfaction that he gets on seeing the number of females. And he says, "The fairer sex is vindicating its rights, not perhaps in the same way that our American female friends might do, but the might do in absolute mastery over man, but yet to compete with him in science and in intellect. He was obviously referring to the fact that in the United States at the time, the women were trying to get the vote. So he said that, you know, at least here they're just interested in education and they just will manage with that. We're not going to give them universal suffrage yet. It's quite interesting that that is even there in the 1860s, the ideas in the 1860s. As you can see from the previous slide, just go back to it for a second, many of the female students took other courses as well at the MII, indication that they wanted a broad scientific education, which could only be achieved through these courses. Women competed equally with the men, as Dukes and Kane have said. Going back to this here, Margaret Swan, this lady here, who achieved the highest prize in 1865. Her marks, because as I say, for many of them, the marks are recorded on Duke's letters. Her marks are the highest marks that I've seen for anybody. She got 956 out of 1,000, so 95.6%. The highest generally was about 700, so she was exceptional in her geology. We'll meet this lady again in a second. So the question comes up, why do they study it? Mentioned already this idea of governesses and teachers, which is something that Kane keeps coming back to and Dukes mentions a couple of times. From the tables, we've seen that their interests are varied, because all of our interests in why we study these things are varied in themselves. Some women solely focus on geology for the love of science, as Kane has commented. Others study geology with other disciplines. One of the principal reasons highlighted is because they wanted to become teachers. And in an environment where education beyond primary level was out of bounds for most women, the idea that a woman would become a teacher, and particularly a teacher of science, must have lit a fire under them to actually encourage others to do similar. The lecture series of the museum enabled women to achieve an education that otherwise would not have been available to them, and to become governesses or teachers in the national system. Swan here is a case in point. So Margaret Swan, who's that lady who achieves 956 points, goes on to become a governess in the Swords Free School. So you can see in the ad, in the announcement that was made in the Evening Freeman in 1866, it talks about her being elected to the post of mistress of the girls' school in Swords. She's been some years training mistress of the Kildare Street School, and has carried off the first prize in geology and physical geography in the examination held in the Museum of Irish Industry. So that is her claim to fame, that she actually is a scientist. She's a geologist who can bring students along with her. Unfortunately, she passes away, from what I can remember, in a carting accident quite soon later. So her influence on women is cut short, which is a great pity. Others, such as the Harman sisters, so Harriet and Hester Harman, both study geology. And these are typical of others who study geology plus something else. So these women study geology and botany. Some also study geology and zoology. And this again looks or answers a question about the need for competent illustrators, which is growing up because we have a lot of books being published. Books require illustrations. We need people to actually illustrate these books. As the popularity of and the professionalism of disciplines of geology and botany in the middle of the 19th century grow, we need these women. And these women were well positioned to fulfill the role of illustrator, although their work is not often accredited. And this is something that Cynthia and Betty have spoken about elsewhere. Just to give you a case in point, in 1859 alone, 541 pages about geology were published in learned journals, and they required 41 lithographic plates. So somebody had to draw those. Similar numbers would have been required in botany. And so a lot of these women that we've seen that are doing the drawing courses are going in to become illustrators in some of these areas. We can see this from the Harmon sisters in their returns from the census. They're both down as artists. So this is the 1871, both of them moved to England. This is the 1871 census where they're in Middlesex, and in 1911 they're still in Middlesex, and they're both still artists. Others are just obviously interested in geology, and Sibthorpe is a case in point. So Miss Sibthorpe scores or gets a prize in 1862. Patrick Wise-Jackson has asked me, and I think that this is possibly true, whether she was the daughter of John Sibthorpe, who ran a marble workshop in Dublin. John Sibthorpe did have a daughter around about that age with that same initial, but I've got absolutely no proof that this is possible, that is definitely her, but the possibility exists that it is her. If that's the case, she's just interested because there are people who have, or her father has a marble work and she wants to know a little bit more about geology, much in the same way as the very first lady we came across, Armstrong. Her father was a builder, and again she would have been interested in geology. And as a segue into my own, that's kind of where I'm coming from as well. And as Betty mentioned, from Cork Harbour, an area that is obviously very interesting geologically, but not only that, in my background, I come from a long line of stonemasons. So geology and rocks is almost in my blood. And for some of these women, it's the exact same thing. So what I've given you is just a whistle-stop tour of the education of women throughout 19th century in geology, particularly with the strengths that the Geological Survey and the Museum of Irish Industry brought with it. Hopefully it's been of some interest to you, and thank you for listening.